אבן אבן יקיר לי, יקיר לי אפרים, אם ילד שעשועים. אבן אבן יקיר לי אפרים, אם ילד שעשועים.
אם מדי דם ריבו זכור אזכרנו, אם מדי דם ריבו זכור אזכרנו.
על כן המום מעלו, רחם רחמנו, נום אדוני.
משמן אבותינו אברהם יצחק ויעקב, הוא יברך את חיילי צבא כנען לישראל. הוא יברך את חיילי צבא כנען לישראל. הוא יברך את חיילי צבא כנען לישראל. עומדים על משמר ארצנו וערי אלוקינו, מהלבנון והמדבר מצרים. La 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 Hashem המבורך לעולם מבורך, לעולם מבורך. נה 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 נה
יקירי אפרים, אם ילד שעשועים, הבן יקירי אפרים, אם ילד שעשועים.
Timidei dam ribo, zachor eskerenu. Timidei dam ribo, zachor eskerenu.
על כן המום מעלו, רחם רחמנו, נום אדוני.
משמן אבותינו, אברהם, יצחק ויעקב, הוא יברך את חיילי צבא כנען לישראל. את חיילי צבא כנען לישראל, הוא יברך את חיילי צבא כנען לישראל. על משמר ארצנו וערי אלוקינו, אם על לבנון ויד מדבר מצרה. La 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 la. Hashem המבורך לעולם מבורך, לעולם מבורך. Na 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 na.
אבן אבן יקירי אפרים, אם ילד שעשועים, הבן יקירי אפרים, אם ילד שעשועים.
תמיד זכור אזכרנו, כי מדי דם ריבו, זכור אזכרנו.
על כן המום מעילו, רחם רחמנו, נום אדוני.
משמן אח אבותינו, אברהם יצחק ויעקב, הוא יברך את חיילי צבא כנען לישראל. את חיילי צבא כנען לישראל, הוא יברך את חיילי צבא כנען לישראל. על משמר ארצנו וערי אלוקינו, מהלבנון והמדבר מצרה. La 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 la.
אבן אבן יכיר לי אפרים, אם ילד שעשועים. אבן אבן יכיר לי אפרים, אם ילד שעשועים.
כי מדי דם ריבו, זכור אזכרנו, כי מדי דם ריבו, זכור אזכרנו.
Good evening and welcome to the Adath Israel Congregation's presentation featuring Dr. Richard Kravatz. Hi, I'm Dr. Ziva Millman. I'm a business school professor and longtime member of Adath Israel Congregation. We know that these are difficult times that our community is experiencing, and we hope that you are all well and safe. We're all very pleased that you're sharing this evening with us. Tonight, we have over 650 people registered for the program. Many thanks for your confidence in Adath for providing timely and relevant programs. The programming committee appreciates the promotional supporters for tonight's program. We would like to thank B'nai B'rith, the Atlantic Jewish Council, Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, Beth Tzedek, and Beth Tikva. Tonight's program features Dr. Richard Kravatz, the highly respected President Emeritus of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. His topic, The New Anti-Semitism, the Campus War Against Israel and Jews, is an important issue and very timely given the new administration in the United States. I'm also pleased to welcome tonight's moderator, Rebecca Katzman. Rebecca graduated from Ryerson University. While attending university, she was president of Ryerson's Students Supporting Israel, and was also a Stand With Us Canada Emerson Fellow. As well, she coordinated the passing of a motion for a Holocaust Education Week. She worked to get the Ryerson Students' Union to be the first in Canada to adopt the Ottawa Protocol on Anti-Semitism and received the John Galvin Award for Student Leadership. Until 2018, Rebecca worked for the Opposition House Leader in the Canadian House of Commons. Currently, she is the Campus Director for Stand With Us Canada, where her role is to empower students and help them educate their peers about Israel. Please help me welcome Rebecca.
Thank you so much, and good evening from Toronto, Canada. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Rebecca Katzman, and I'm looking forward to being your moderator for tonight. Dr. Kravatz is our special guest, and we will be talking about an issue that is near and dear to all of our hearts. As you know, there is an unfair demonization of Israel on university campuses globally. Jewish and pro-Israel university students across North America and around the world are constantly faced with the state of Israel being held to a higher standard than any other country. This is greatly exaggerated by the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement and their student governments that stand behind it. Unfortunately, some student governments have adopted the BDS motion, and as a result, there is a current increase in campus anti-Semitism. When I was involved with Stand With Us Canada at Ryerson University, I attended a meeting where the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement was on the table. I witnessed the movement pass before my eyes. I also witnessed a Holocaust Education Week walkout during a student government meeting because Students for Justice in Palestine believed that instead we should be discussing the Palestinian Holocaust. I am deeply passionate about this topic, and anyone who believes that Jews do not have the right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland crosses a line in my book. There are, of course, some people that may be ignorant on this topic, and they think there's a difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, but it is our responsibility to educate these individuals that they are one and the same. We are fortunate to have Dr. Kravatz help us understand what is happening at our universities regarding the campus war against Israel and Jews. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Richard L. Kravatz. He's the creator and founding director of Boston University's program, Publishing in Digital Media. Dr. Kravatz has also taught more than 20 courses in advertising, marketing, and consumer behavior at many major universities. He has also published over 400 articles and book chapters on campus anti-Semitism, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, campus free speech, terrorism, constitutional law, Middle East politics, and social policy in many newspapers and journals. He lectures nationally on the topic of higher education, academic freedom, and the Middle East. Dr. Kravatz is a board member of the Journal for the Study of Anti-Semitism, the Israel Group, the Louis Brandeis Center for Human Rights, amongst many more. He is also President Emeritus of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. If you would like to submit questions for our guest speaker, please click on the chat conversation button. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Kravatz.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, although it's a mixed blessing, of course, because I'm honored to be asked to speak at Adath Israel and other institutions, but the reason for my presence here in discussing this is not something that we should necessarily take pleasure in or be happy about. Talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and particularly how it manifests itself on university campuses, brings to mind the title of the great British journalist's recent book, Melanie Phillips, The World Turned Upside Down, because she talks about a Europe which has seen the coming of multiculturalism and a subsuming of Western values to radical Islam, anti-Semitism, anti-Western thought, and a wave of ideology which has engulfed Europe and threatens its survival as a free and open society. And nowhere is that world turned upside down more relevant and obvious than on university campuses, which is going to be, as noticed, the topic for tonight's speech. I'm going to attempt, because it's obviously a very broad and extensive topic, to try to identify some recurring tropes and themes of the false narrative that's been created about Israel on university campuses, and look at the ways that the enemies of Israel and the ideologues and activists who are trying to slander, demean, and diminish Israel's reputation in the community of nations articulate their false narrative and portray Israel in a way that is an inverse of reality. The world turned upside down, what Melanie Phillips in her book calls a dialogue of the demented, where truth is turned on its head so that lies are considered to be reality. And it's a very dangerous thing, because as Israel is made to be a pariah in the world community, it opens itself and is exposed as a country that doesn't deserve to be protected. And in fact, we see that every time it has to defend its citizens from being murdered by Hamas or Hezbollah or other actors that wish it ill, it is criticized for the way it defends itself in a way that no other nation on earth is criticized for securing peace and the survival of its citizenry. So I'm going to give an overview of who the people are that are driving this anti-Semitism, this new anti-Semitism, which uses the Jew of nations, Israel, as the focus of their hatred, where classic anti-Semitism is no longer fashionable, even among the elite. And in the West, it's something that people, unless you're on the extreme fringes of society, don't express openly. But it's very easy and very acceptable to attack the Jewish state and use it as a proxy for a hatred of Jews, which it often is. On this first slide of my presentation, I like to show this because it typifies the way that Israel is depicted, particularly in its relationship with the Palestinians. So as you'll notice in other motifs and illustrations that we're going to see tonight, Israel in this is depicted as a piece of machinery. There's no humanity about it. It's an Apache warship, and it is sending a missile to kill an innocent Palestinian child holding a teddy bear. So this idea that Israel is a colonial oppressor of an indigenous people who have done nothing to deserve their fate, and Israel is a militaristic, barbaric murderer of children, is reinforced by a lot of the propaganda as part of the narrative against Israel. You see that this child is surrounded in what looks like the walls of a prison or a concentration camp, which echoes a repeated theme that Gaza is the world's largest outdoor prison, and that Israel's occupation has enclosed the Palestinians in a brutal, inhumane way that robs them of their dignity. And Israel, as portrayed by this Apache helicopter in this particular poster for Israeli Apartheid Week, is inhuman. It's a piece of machinery. It has no feelings or concern for the innocence of Arabs' lives, even their children, because of their barbarity. I teach marketing, and all of you are familiar with the idea of branding, where we try to give a product a perception for the consumers that we wish to enjoy or buy or consume our product. And branding is a way of making your particular product more attractive than your competitors' products. And countries also brand themselves. So there's a company in England run by Simon Anholt who does a brand index survey, which is a way of asking people, in this case over 25,000 consumers, what they thought of different countries based on the attractiveness of the country, what they think about the people of that country, how that country operates, and so forth. And so 35 countries were surveyed, and to nobody's shock at all, Israel, an open society, a democracy in a sea of totalitarian nations, with a free press and free elections and a vibrant Western-style economy, with enormous amount of medical advances and technological advances, and a place where the innovation is equivalent to what's going on in America, Israel ends up at the bottom of this list, below countries like North Korea and Yemen and China. And one has to wonder why. Well, there's a concept in marketing called brand hijack. And a brand hijack in the conventional sense is when the consumers of a particular brand, like Barbie dolls or Harley Davidson or Apple computers and other high-profile brands, are so in love with the product that they take over the marketing by telling their friends and going out in the world and trumpeting the wonderful qualities of that particular brand. But a brand can also be hijacked in a negative way, where the competitors of the brand have co-opted the way that people perceive that particular product. And in the case of Israel, that's exactly what's happened, in my opinion, that Israel's brand has been hijacked by the enemies of Israel, by the Arab world, by those in the West that despise Israel for its Jewishness or for the freedoms that it offers its citizens, for those people that hate it because it occupies what is perceived to be and contended to be Muslim land, and so forth. So the idea that Israel, with all of its strengths and qualities that are positive, shows up in a national brand index at the bottom of the list, tells you that the brand has clearly been hijacked and that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way it's perceived. So here's the way that Israel brands itself. And you see that there's a photo spread that was done in Maxim magazine a number of years ago of women in the IDF, because Israel wanted to have a perception that the military and its society and its women were attractive, and make people have a more favorable, especially young people, have a more favorable attitude. And of course, like other countries, it offers tourism and business opportunities and places for people to relocate and to do business with and to visit as tourists. And this is the way that Israel sees itself and wants the world to see itself. And for the most part, actually is. This is the reality of what Israel is. This, however, is what Israel looks like when its brand has been hijacked. And here you see some recurring motifs, just like the poster we opened with. You see on the top was a billboard which was putting pressure on Americans to cut aid to Israel over 10 years, $30 billion. And what was the message? Stop killing children, no more military aid to Israel. The idea that Israel is using its military to murder defenseless, innocent Palestinian and Arab children, of course, is what is thought to be the reality, when we all know that Israel has been fighting for its survival from those who wish to wipe it off the map and exterminate every Jew wherever they are. Not only in Israel, but Hezbollah, for example, has publicly proclaimed that it wants to kill Jews wherever we find them. Not just Zionists, not just Israeli Jews, but Jews because they are Jewish. The picture to the right of the boy, again, using a child symbolically, throwing a rock against a Israeli tank, reinforces the same exact theme that we saw in the poster, where Israel is not even a person. It's a piece of machinery. It's a brutal, oppressive, mechanical, barbaric, and murderous piece of equipment with no humanity, attacking a poor child who has nothing but a stone to protect himself. And the other ones, you see below that, there's another shot of a child in front of a tank that was used for a poster for an anti-Israel event on campus. And on the left, there's a picture of a man at a checkpoint. And the message of that is, of course, that there's no reason that Israel would have that's reasonable why they would ever make Palestinian Arabs go through a checkpoint, because no Palestinian Arab has ever tried to murder Jews randomly with suicide vests or guns or knives or cars or in 100 other ways. And Israel has been forced to set up checkpoints and to build a security fence and to take measures to protect its citizens from randomly being murdered by terrorists who feel that Israel has no right to exist. Erwin Kotler, a former member of parliament in Canada, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, made an interesting observation that in the 20th century, the worst charge that you could give to someone was that they were a racist. And where did racism most visibly become apparent in the 20th century? Well, in Nazism and in apartheid South Africa. And I think it's very noteworthy that Nazism and apartheid are used promiscuously in attacking Israel, in defining what Israel stands for, so that Israel is referred to by its enemies as an apartheid racist regime, and that you see posters on campuses. In fact, we'll probably see one in the presentation later, where Auschwitz is said to be equivalent to Gaza, as if the Nazi Holocaust is somehow equivalent to the purported Holocaust being perpetrated on the Palestinians by Israel. I think that the idea of minimizing the Third Reich's activities by assuming that Israel is perpetrating another Nazi-like Holocaust is a perversion. What my colleague and friend, Professor Landis, called morally grotesque, the idea that Israelis are the new Nazis, that the people in Israel, many of whom were actual victims and survivors of the actual Holocaust, are now being called Nazis themselves for the way that they purportedly treat the Palestinians. So what's going on campuses that's leading so many students to have these negative views on campus? Why are students who are otherwise very sensitive and tolerant and well-meaning, who want to protect the underclass and the underrepresented and the marginalized communities and groups on campuses and elsewhere in the world. Why is this happening? So I want to trace with you some of the ways that academia has helped to fuel the anti-Semitic or new anti-Semitism, this movement and campaign against Israel. One of the reasons that we see a hesitation for faculty and students to be supportive of Israel is that there's a huge imbalance in the way that professors see the world and in their ideology. So, as you can tell from the last election and from the election with Obama and with Bush before that, the population in general, not always, but in general, is 50-50 liberals to conservatives, Democrats to Republicans. But when we look at universities, in the hard sciences and in business school and in medical school and the STEM disciplines, we see a self-professed identification of professors of 3-to-1 liberal to conservatives. But if we look at the humanities and anthropology, sociology, history, philosophy, and English, the range of self-defined liberals to conservatives is 37-to-1, 28-to-1. These ridiculously high and imbalanced comparisons of liberals to conservatives. What does that mean? It means that liberals are more likely to see Israel as a colonial, militaristic occupier of an indigenous people's land. They're more likely to sign boycott resolutions when they're put through campuses. They're more likely to sign petitions to introduce academic boycotts so that Israeli scholars are prevented from coming to American universities and studying. So Israeli academics are unable to publish in certain journals because they're from Israel, because they're from the Jewish state, and because they're made to be complicit in the occupation and in the stealing of indigenous land from the Arab population there. So the fact that there's a tremendous imbalance is the reason that so many professors have fallen into the trap where they see Israel as a nation not deserving to be defended. There's been several definitions written about what constitutes anti-Semitism, and universities now have been gradually accepting the latest, very useful International Holocaust Remembrances Association definition of anti-Semitism. And why this is important on university campuses is that university administrators have a very difficult job in defining what is actually anti-Semitic and what is just criticism of Israel. The anti-Semites on university campuses, particularly student groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, are very clever in pretending that all that they are doing is critiquing Zionism, that they're critiquing the Jewish state's politics, that they have nothing against Jews, but they don't believe that Jews in Israel deserve Jewish self-determination, even though they believe that Palestinians deserve Palestinian self-determination. So the adoption of this IHRA definition is valuable because it lets administrators understand that when student groups are demonizing repeatedly the one Jewish state and deny Jews self-determination and accuse Jews of being the new Nazis, and when they say that Zionism is equivalent to racism, that Zionism being a fundamental part of Judaism and being Jewish in a spiritual sense, not in a political sense, means that they are actually being anti-Semitic. Now, people have wanted to reject this because they say, well, it's going to stifle free speech. Well, we don't care if the anti-Semites want to be anti-Semitic and utter whatever they want, but we want college administrators and others to be able to say, you can say whatever you want, but we want you to know that you're being anti-Semitic. That's why it's a useful tool by adopting this definition, even though it's trying to be rejected by the people that are actually perpetrating the anti-Semitism on campus. I mentioned Students for Justice in Palestine because they are the most virulent and destructive and organized group working on campuses as the campus brown shirts, in essence, of the anti-Israel movement. They are the ones that sponsor every resolution pushed through student governments to call on their respective universities to boycott, divest, and issue sanctions against Israel. They're the ones that shout down pro-Israel speakers on campuses. They're the ones that build mock apartheid walls during Israeli Apartheid Week every year and call Jewish students on their respective campuses racists and new Nazis for supporting Israel. They're the ones that walk around with posters like the one you see there, holding a flag of Israel, except the Jewish star has been replaced by the swastika. They're the ones that invite speakers that call for the death of Zionism and call for resistance against Israel, and resistance, of course, being a euphemism for terrorism and the murder of Jews. Even though these students purport to be so sensitive and tolerant and the most open-minded and loving students on campus, they are in fact the ones calling for the murder of Jews in their quest for Palestinian statehood. So I want you to watch this very short clip of a Berkeley anti-Israel protest, and it encapsulates several of the themes we've mentioned before, but I want to show you how deadly and vitriolic and how perverse this language is. And this is language that's accepted on the 200 campuses where Students for Justice in Palestine, for example, have chapters and do this promiscuously as a way of defaming and constantly libeling Israel.
And let it be known that we here in Berkeley support the Intifada. Intifada, Intifada, we support the Intifada.
Intifada, we support the Intifada.
Intifada, Intifada.
Intifada.
Intifada, Intifada, we support the 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 Intifada.
Let the people of Palestine hear you. Free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free
Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free Palestine.
Free, free.
This demonstration is typical because it's so inane, but imagine, if you will, that a white supremacist student group, which could never and would never exist on a university campus for one day, but assume that it could, and they were standing outside saying, string them up, send them back to Africa. Can you imagine the outrage of the university? Can you imagine any students being able to articulate that? When these students are yelling intifada, intifada, what are they saying? An intifada is an uprising with the intent purpose of murdering Jews for no reason, purportedly to end the occupation, but that's not going to happen. And the idea that these students who feel themselves to be so ennobled and virtuous because they're campaigning on behalf of the ever aggrieved Palestinians, but are calling for the death of Jews, it's frightening that university students at Berkeley, one of the elite universities in America, would be unable to see the irony in that they're trying to be helpful to one people and thoughtful about preserving them and achieving statehood for them. And yet they're saying in the same breath that it's okay to murder another group of people on behalf of these people. It's outrageous. The other lie here is that Israel practices apartheid. And you've all heard the repeated trope, Israel is an apartheid regime, that the security fence, which was built to defend Israeli citizens from terrorists who were murdering them, and in actuality reduced the terrorism by 80% after it was built, is called an apartheid wall, not a security fence, as if it was built somehow to keep white Jews separate from brown Arabs. There's nothing racial about the conflict there, but that's the way it's portrayed on American campuses, that white Jews who came from Europe after the Second World War and had no connection to the land of Israel before that, stole this country called Palestine from the Arabs, took it over, and then suppressed the Palestinians and made an apartheid regime in which the Arabs had no rights and the Jews had all rights. And again, you see from this poster being held by this wonderful student that Zionism is racism, something that the UN tried to push through in the 1970s and that rears its head again, as if Zionism is some type of a political ideology which has as its motive to suppress brown people. The idea that Israel is racist, of course, in today's world, particularly after the death of George Floyd and then the Black Lives Matter era, the idea that Israel is somehow a racist country resonates with a lot of other students, including Black students who are enlisted frequently by Students for Justice in Palestine to bring them into the tent of attacking Israel, of making Israel a pariah nation that's undeserving of protection. Why is this deadly and dangerous? Because if Israel is in fact the new Nazi nation, if Israelis are brutal, inhumane murderers of Arab children, if they practice apartheid, if they're subjugating an indigenous people, if they stole the land on which they built this new nation of Israel from a place called Palestine, as if Palestine was a pre-existing country, a sovereign nation. If they did all of those things, why would they ever deserve to be protected? Why should they have the ability to defend their citizenry? Why should the UN or any Western nations speak up for Israel if some nation like Iran wants to destroy them? That's the danger of this. It's not just talk about how bad Israel is. It's the fact that it's repeated over and over again in a way that Israel has no redeeming features, that this narrative, this brand hijacking has been done in such a way that Israel is made to look like it doesn't deserve to be in the community of civilized nations and therefore sort of deserves what it gets. That's the danger and the existential problem that Israel faces with all of this activism. I think we should probably turn over our presentation for questions that you might have, having heard some of these themes, if that's okay.
Thank you so much. This is perfect. We want to give some time for questions. I just want to thank you for the very informative lecture. It was great. I'd like to start off by asking you a question. I know that you have experience with both Canadian and US universities. I was just wondering if you can explain the differences between the two campus climates.
Well, I know that certain universities in Canada have had their problems, like York, University of Toronto, where Jewish students were trapped in a room where anti-Israel activists were beating on the walls to the extent that the Jewish students were afraid for their life and had to be escorted by security out of the building. At Concordia University, you remember that Benjamin Netanyahu was giving a talk, and students, which is typical of the anti-Israel students, not only do they want to be able to freely tell lies about Israel, but they don't want anybody to be able to tell the truth about Israel. So whenever they can, they try to shout down or have canceled speakers that are speaking on behalf of Israel, because they don't want the other side of the story to be told, because they know that what they're saying isn't the whole truth, or that they just don't believe that Israel deserves to even have a voice. So Concordia, York, University of Toronto have all had problems. You don't have a Students for Justice in Palestine, but you have similar groups where there's been conflict, and there's even been violent conflict recently. So the rhetoric and the ideology is the same. The tactics are slightly different, but the student groups are very adept at finding ways of eliminating speech that defends Israel. As I said, sometimes if a speaker is coming that they know is a pro-Israel speaker and is a well-known speaker, they'll go to the administration and claim that he's an Islamophobe so that they can get him canceled, which is good for them. Sometimes, in the case of Michael Oren at the University of California at Irvine, Students for Justice in Palestine stood up, and 11 students eventually were arrested and had to be taken out of the room because they were trying to shut down the speaker and wouldn't let him speak. So those tactics are the same. Israel Apartheid Week actually started in Canada. So you were ahead of the game in that respect.
Yeah, it's definitely not a good thing to be ahead of the game there, but definitely. And, I work with some students at Concordia, and they'll sometimes make comments saying, even if we weren't at school, that's still, that event with Bibi Netanyahu is still something that sticks with me. And I've heard that a lot. And even with the situation at York, it's the same. Like, students that weren't there still heard of the story, and it still scares them. But they're resilient, and they fight, and they advocate for Israel. So thank you very much. You mentioned SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine. An attendee asked, who is funding Students for Justice in Palestine?
That's unclear. The group is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the funding comes through, it's kind of dark money that comes through various channels. It's evident that they get funding because they're actually very good at what they do. They do a lot of theater, and people are always wondering why Jewish students don't have as much success in having pro-Israel events. And the reason is, when Jewish students, like you probably did, have a pro-Israel event, it usually involves, singing folk songs or having Jewish Israeli food or something like that, or celebrating independence or something positive. Students for Justice in Palestine presents themselves as a pro-Palestinian group, but they're not a pro-Palestinian group. They do nothing for the Palestinian cause. They never tried to convince the Palestinians to reach an actual peace agreement, or to give up on terrorism, or to end the incitement against Israelis and their desire to murder Jews. Students for Justice in Palestine and groups like them are actually, by definition, anti-Israel groups. So everything that they do is to attack Israel. They don't do anything to promote Palestinianism or to promote the Palestinian cause or to even help them achieve statehood. In fact, much of what they do actually harms the Palestinians. For example, the boycott divestment movement was effective in getting SodaStream to shut down its factory, where several hundred Arabs were employed. There was a mosque on the site of the business, and they had good paying jobs at the prevailing rates because it was in the West Bank. But the boycotters wanted it to be shut down because they didn't want a Jewish business doing business in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. And so to prove their point, they actually hurt the Palestinians. That's my point.
Yeah, definitely. On campus, a lot of Jewish students do proactive programming. And, when it comes to BDS and things like that, unfortunately, we do have to be reactive. But there's a lot of organizations on the ground that are willing to combat that falsehood and that double standard and that hatred. So you mentioned Judea and Samaria. Somebody asked, why are Jews not considered indigenous? So it kind of blends into that.
Well, that's a history lesson. That's part of this false narrative that has developed over the years. Obviously, the Palestinians tried to claim that they are indigenous, that the Jews had no connection. One of the slides that was coming up was a book called Facts on the Ground, which was written by a Barnard professor about Israeli archaeology. And she's a pro-Palestinian. She admits it in the book. Her thesis for the book was that Jews had no connection to the Temple Mount or Jerusalem or anything, and that Jewish archaeologists, Israeli archaeologists, who are among the most scrupulous and careful in the world, invented a connection between Jews and the Holy Land by looking for artifacts which supported the fact that they had a presence there. Arafat told Bill Clinton that there was never a temple on the Temple Mount. And any Christian or Jew knows that that's a historical fact. But the Palestinians have promoted this idea that there was never any temples on the Temple Mount, that that's a Muslim holy place. UNESCO several years ago was trying to designate the Western Wall as a Muslim holy place. Why is that? When everybody knows it's impossible because it was built 1,000 years before Muhammad was even born. So how could that be a Muslim holy place? Because it's the willingness of Western elites to fall for this narrative that Jews only showed up in what became Israel after the Holocaust, after the Second World War, and there was no previous connection, because it gives the Palestinians a superior claim, as if who was there first is more important. And because in their heart of hearts, the Palestinians and Arab world know that the Jews were there first, they have to come up with a false narrative that contradicts that.
Well, we have a question about professors now. Somebody asked, aren't most professors against Jews in Israel, for example, like them being anti-Semitic? What can Jewish people or Jewish students or even pro-Israel students can do to change this?
You can't change the professors. There's an interesting website called Canary Mission. Nobody knows who funds it and nobody knows who runs it. But what it does is identify student activists and professors and groups that are anti-Israel, and it does it not by breaking into their computers, but by posting videos and tweets and blog posts and articles and other things that these anti-Semitic and anti-Israel people have done. So to answer your question, what can you do? You're not going to be able to change the ideology of the professors, obviously, but you can not take courses from those particular professors. Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, which is the group that I was president of several years ago, we are comprised of 30,000 faculty on 3,200 campuses around the world. And we have pro-Israel boots on the ground, so that when there's anti-Israel activism and events going on campus, we can send in professors and students to combat that and to try to neutralize the danger and ill effects of that kind of agitation. Professors are what they are. You saw from that slide showing the imbalance in their ideology that it's a terrible and challenging task to try to combat their animus towards Israel. In the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at Columbia, for example, 95% of the faculty are anti-Western, anti-colonial, anti-Israel, anti-American ideologues who are, and many are anti-Semitic at that, who are brazen about their antipathy for Israel. The AMCA initiative, on whose board I sit, has done a study to see who are the professors that sign these BDS and boycott resolutions, and they typically come from these Middle Eastern studies departments, which are supposed to be neutral in ideology because they're funded by the government to give us strategic advice. But in fact, they become politicized propaganda machines against Israel and America. So it's a danger.
Yeah, I definitely deal with many students who are on a daily basis. Maybe they didn't know their professor was anti-Israel or anti-Semitic, I should just say. And they come to us and they struggle. But there are some students that do stand up. But it's very, very hard, right? It's hard being in a position where you have to get up and potentially be alone. So thank you for answering that. An attendee asked, do you think in your wildest dreams that this liberal academic professor domination will change under Trudeau or Biden?
No. If anything, it will get worse, and they'll be less concerned about expressing their liberality, because what happened with there was an interesting phenomenon when Trump came into office. All of these professors who had been so anti-Israel and who were fomenting this new anti-Semitism by being anti-Israel, and all of these student groups suddenly had a new boogeyman on which to focus the source of anti-Semitism in their minds, and it was the white supremacists. So you started hearing that as soon as Trump was elected, liberal professors started saying, oh, there's a lot of anti-Semitism on campuses, and where is it coming from? Not from us, who despise Israel and participate in all of these anti-Israel events. No, it's from the white supremacists. Well, there's absolutely no presence of white supremacy on campuses. Sometimes some lunatic from outside of the campus will fax white power flyers to the campus, or will put a swastika in a bathroom or something like that. But there isn't one single white power department. There isn't one single visible white power professor. There's no white power student groups or Aryan Nation student groups. They're totally invisible on campus. So all during the Trump administration, while all the liberals were bemoaning the rise of the alt-right and white power, it was a phantom to deflect the blame that they actually share in fomenting anti-Semitic thought by their hatred of Israel.
So speaking of that, we got another question. Anti-Semitism exists in both right and left groups. On the right, the groups are small in number, loosely organized and overt, relative to leftist groups who are large in number, well organized and covert. So the person says the left is very active politically. The British Labour Party, the US Democratic Party, Squad, the Iran deal, UN positions, and therefore it's the more dangerous party. So the participant just wants you to comment on that statement.
I totally agree for all the reasons that I just said. You know, even an organization like the Anti-Defamation League, which unfortunately has lost part of its mission, and instead of going after left-wing anti-Semitism, it focuses obsessively on right-wing anti-Semitism. So they were, their new director is a veteran of the Obama administration, and it has a natural disinclination to explore left-wing anti-Semitism and left-wing hatred of Israel. So he's very happy to focus the organization's attention on the right. The problem, as I see it, is that the right wing, as I just mentioned, has no presence on university campuses. And to the extent that they even exist off campus, they have no political power. They have no financial power. They don't even have an organizational structure. You know, there's some white Aryan Nation kind of guys. There's these neo-Nazis who live in their mother's basement with pictures of Hitler on the wall. Who cares? they don't do anything. Once in a while, there's obviously some danger that some of them will shoot up a synagogue or something. That's something we can't anticipate. That's the random work of a maniac or a sociopath. But as far as influencing public opinion, they have absolutely, in my mind, have absolutely no impact. The danger of the kind of anti-Israel and anti-Semitic thought and ideology that we've talked about tonight is that it's coming from Columbia University, Harvard University, Berkeley University, University of California, all of the great schools, University of Chicago, are infected with this, and it's masquerades as social justice. So everybody thinks that they're being good people and tolerant people and the very best people on campus, not like those mean Republicans or those neo-Nazis. We're good people. And we want to stand up for the Palestinians at the expense of Israel and to the detriment of Israel. And even if Israel goes away, well, they deserved it because they're the new Nazis. And I find that to be very dangerous because they have the credibility that comes from being part of elite academic settings. You all remember the book, The Israel Lobby by Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer. So Walt was from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and Mearsheimer was from the University of Chicago. And that book purported to show that America's support of Israel was only strong because Jews had this cabal that controlled and manipulated policy and had Congress under its thumb. Well, that was a retelling of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The problem was that it was written by somebody from Harvard University and University of Chicago in Brooks Brothers suits, not some lunatic in the KKK like David Duke, who had no credibility and no academic institution behind them. That's the danger of that kind of anti-Israel activism, that it's dressed up in a way that gives it credibility and influence. And that Columbia University's and Georgetown University's School of Diplomacy, which has a direct effect on diplomats in American government, has taken millions and millions of dollars from the Saudis to fund their operations and is run by a guy that has never seen a terrorist that he admitted was an actual Islamist. And therefore, I find that to be a dangerous situation, much more than some lunatic in his mother's basement saying Heil Hitler.
Yeah. Thank you. We have time for one more question. So I'm just going to ask it. We're veering off from this topic. We're going on to the next. We have an attendee who asked, as a passionate supporter of Israel, I am also deeply offended by some of its political machinery, and in particular by its current leadership. As a Jew, I do have a right to be openly critical of the political machinery without being branded by some as anti-Israel. So just asking about criticism.
Is that a question?
Yeah, so just asking about the leadership of Israel, like, can you be openly critical?
Well, yes, she has the right and responsibility to be critical of Israeli politics. And in fact, part of that IHRA definition of anti-Semitism says that criticism of Israel, like criticism of all countries, is fine. There's nothing wrong with criticizing Israel. But calling Israel, the new Nazis, that it's an apartheid regime, that it doesn't have the right morally or legally to exist, that all the settlements and even the country itself is illegitimate and illegal, and that its founding was based on an illegality and it's immoral and it shouldn't be protected by law or any other thing. That criticism that is beyond all bounds and is only focused obsessively on Israel verges into anti-Semitism. Yes, people can have issues with Netanyahu, and people can have an issue with the settlements and whether that's good domestic policy. But calling those people, telling those people that they deserve to be murdered by sociopaths who want to resist occupation, supposedly, no, that veers into a totally different area. just in the way that we can all criticize Trump or we can criticize Biden. But when you start calling Trump, the new Hitler, and that he's creating concentration camps on the border, then it becomes not political speech and a conversation that's focused in reality, but something else, an irrational hatred, which is what anti-Semitism is.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's all we have for time. So thank you for all your amazing answers. Our viewers appreciate it.
I'm not sure if my internet is working very well, but I just wanted to say we hope everyone found tonight's program very informative and interesting. It's so important that students and all of us hear the truth instead of the perceptions that are being portrayed about Israel. There was, just talking about something very close to home, last week, the CBC, which is a radio and TV station in Canada that's funded by the government, by the Canadian government, came out and said that Israel is denying COVID vaccinations to the Palestinians. And Honest Reporting had to jump on that and address it. So we see this takes place on everywhere. Richard, you've given us much to think about and share with others, and to encourage everyone to ask questions and initiate conversations and try and spread accurate information. I have to say it takes a lot of courage in some situations, but it's so important. On behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you for an incredible talk. Thanks also to Rebecca Katzman for serving as this evening's moderator. Special thanks to the Adult Programming Committee, chaired by Joe Traeger, and the Adath staff, Phil David, Executive Director, for putting on tonight's program. A recording of tonight's presentation will be posted on the Adath website in a few days. And we look forward to seeing everyone again on February 9th at 7 p.m. We will host Brad Slomovec. He is a Canadian photo essayist and emergency doctor, and he will present his acclaimed recent photos, which were featured on the front page of the Israel Times. On February 21st at 1 p.m., we'll hear Dr. Tal Becker, legal counsel for the Abraham Accords, Israel's peace treaty. And thank you all for attending. Stay well and good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.